I want to thank the Sierra Club, Nebraskans for Peace, the University of Nebraska in Omaha. I've been to Lincoln, and now I've been to Omaha. I'm not going to say one's better than the other, but it's great to have been to both now. It is my pleasure to talk about the issue of climate change, the Madhouse Effect. It's the title of our recent book, and as David said, the book was published prior to the election. At the time we published the book, I can't tell you how many colleagues of mine came to me and said, climate change denial is so 90s, it's so yesterday, beyond all of that. Now, we're on to the worthy debate over policy and solving this problem. Unfortunately, history had another idea in mind, and we did end up getting a president, Donald Trump, who is our very first climate change denying president. He is on record literally denying the science of climate change. I have updated the title of my talk, The Madhouse Effect, Climate Change Denial in the Age of Trump. We are now very much back in the madhouse of climate change denialism, with a president and a Congress led by congressional Republicans who are also in denial of the basic facts about climate change. So the basic facts. Let me start up with chapter 1. First of all, science. How does it work? Okay, because there is so much mythology, there's so many fallacies when it comes not just to the science of climate change, but today we live in this world of alternative facts where it's difficult to get some people to even accept sort of the basic workings of science and to trust the findings of science. Too often we allow contrarians in the climate change debate to frame themselves as modern-day Galileos railing at the scientific establishment. That's not skepticism, right? Skepticism is a good thing in science. It's an essential thing in science. But the indiscriminate rejection of overwhelmingly established scientific findings is not skepticism. That's a sort of one-sided skepticism, the contrarianism, or a denial. It's denial of basic science. And I'd like to quote when it comes to the issue of scientific skepticism, perhaps the most eloquent person to ever weigh in on the matter was Carl Sagan, who many of you may remember, one of the great communicators, science communicators of all time. And I think he put it very aptly when he said, the fact that some geniuses were laughed at does not imply that all who are laughed at are geniuses. They laughed at Galileo, they laughed at Fulton, they laughed at the Wright brothers, but they also laughed at Bozo the Clown. And for every Wright brothers, for every Galileo, there are 1,000, there are a million Bozos the Clown out there on the internet typing away. And we are left with a public discourse that is polluted by misinformation and disinformation. The other pet peeve that I have is this idea that we have to treat matters of science as the same way we treat political matters, as if we present both sides. The earth is flat, the earth is round. And we hope that the middle is somewhere in between, or at least that's the way the media often treats it. It's what we call false balance. The idea that you can put on the same footing sort of the marginal claims and views of a small number of representatives from fossil fuel interests, or representatives of front groups funded by fossil fuel interests, a few contrarians, and you somehow put that on the same footing as the overwhelming consensus of the world's scientists. Now, lest you think that this is just a problem, for example, in the world of the conservative media, let me point out that the New York Times, their most recent hire to their editorial board, is a climate change denier. Okay? Now, Bret Stephens would claim he doesn't deny climate change, but if you look at what he actually has to say, for example, his very first editorial, he made the argument that, look, the polls were off during the last presidential election, and if the polling could be off, well, then these climate scientists clearly be wrong about the science of climate change. So that's the New York Times. The New York Times is bought into this false balance, this fallacy that you have to present both sides when dealing with matters of fact. Bret Stephens is free to present his opinions about the implications of climate change and matters of policy, but in the famous words of Daniel P. Moynihan, he's not entitled to his own facts. And that's the way the New York Times is now actually dealing with this issue. So it's a step backward. What about the science? What about the science of climate change? We're about as certain about human-caused climate change as we are about anything in science. As I like to say, proof, people who demand proof, proof isn't for science, proof is for mathematical theorems and alcoholic beverages. It's not for science. In science, we deal with weights of evidence. We deal with degrees of confidence. And there's always uncertainty. But just as we're not completely certain about the theory of gravity, there are still physicists debating about the role of the fundamental forces. We've never detected a graviton. So you could say there's still some uncertainties about gravity. That doesn't mean that it's safe to jump off a cliff, right? We know not to jump off a cliff. But here, when it comes to climate change, we're literally some people are asking us to jump off the cliff, given the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence that the problem is real, it's human-caused, and it represents a threat. To not act would be to jump off the cliff. Another pet peeve of mine, when it comes to the discourse over climate change, the public discourse, the sort of framing of extreme weather events. Climate change and extreme weather. The critics will say, well, you can never prove that climate change caused that extreme weather event. And it's the same defense that a steroid-taking baseball player would use to say, well, you can never prove that the third home run that I hit of that season was caused by the steroids. Therefore, I'm absolved. It doesn't work that way. We know that statistically speaking, the overall increase that we're seeing in many types of extreme weather events can be related to climate change. We are seeing an increase in the frequency and severity of extreme droughts and heat waves and floods in a way that cannot be explained just by natural climate variability. We just published an article on this very matter about a month and a half ago, where we showed that climate change is influencing the jet stream in a way that made some of the extreme events that we've seen in recent years, the 2010 California wildfires, the 2011 Texas and Oklahoma drought and heat wave, and many other events. We have changed the pattern of the jet stream in a way that makes these events more common. It causes the jet stream to exhibit larger sort of undulations as it travels across the country, which gives you larger weather anomalies, and the jet stream tends to get locked in place. So the same locations day after day get rained on or get baked by the sun, and that's when you get record flooding like we saw a little bit to the east over the last week or so, or record drought and record heat waves. So there is a connection. We know there's a connection. Why should we care? Well, it's not just about the penguins and the polar bears. As I sometimes point out, I always show a slide in my talks on climate change with a polar bear stranded on an ice floe, because it's the law. If you give a talk about climate change, polar bear stranded on an ice floe. But by making the polar bear or the penguin the poster child of climate change, we have, in a sense, wrongly at times conveyed to the public that this is some exotic problem way off. In the Arctic, maybe it's a problem for polar bears, but why should I care? Well, climate change is impacting us on a daily basis. It's playing out in real time in the 24-hour news cycle, on our television screens, in our newspapers. The impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. We are seeing the negative impacts of climate change, whether it's extreme weather, food, water, human health, national security, as my colleague Dave Titley speaks to very eloquently. The greatest threat to our national security is climate change, because it's a threat multiplier. These are some of the reasons that we should care. And in fact, the best reason walking up the steps right now, because what sort of world do we want to leave behind for our children and grandchildren, ultimately? The stages of denial. So there's sort of this canon, there's this logical progression when it comes to climate change denials. And it starts out like, look, it's not happening, it's not happening. There's a pause. Well, there's no pause in warming. We just had our third consecutive warmest year on record. 2016 was the warmest year on record, beating out 2015, which was the warmest year on record, beating out 2014, the warmest year on record. 2017 has a fighting chance to be a fourth consecutive record global temperature. How about the record warmth we saw this February over a large part of the U.S., including, yes, here in Nebraska. That impacted much of the country. Well, some of the critics will then say, well, okay, you know what, maybe it's happening, but it's natural. I mean, stovetop temperatures change naturally all the time. Well, actually, with that 2015 heat wave, we're pretty sure it wasn't natural. There was actually an attribution study done by a number of scientists to look at the likelihood. You could take a climate model and you can run it under sort of pre-industrial CO2 levels and see how often it generates a certain type of event. And then you run it with elevated CO2 and you see how often it generates that sort of event. And that record February warmth happens 3 times more likely when you elevate CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. So we can't prove that it was caused by climate change, but we think we see the fingerprint of climate change in heat waves like that February heat wave and in the overall warming of the planet. It cannot be explained by natural climate variability. Another sort of take on this it's natural sort of argument advanced by folks like James Inhofe, the senator from Oklahoma, the senior senator of Oklahoma, that a snowball in the winter is somehow in Washington, D.C. is disproof against climate change. Actually, some of the record nor'easters that Washington, D.C. has seen in recent years, the fact that there was so much snow was a result of unusually warm Atlantic sea surface temperatures. That means there's more moisture in the atmosphere, and you can get larger snowfalls. So if anything, some of those record snowfalls are actually indicative of what we expect to happen along the eastern seaboard with some of these winter storms. Well, James Inhofe, is one of the primary climate change deniers in the U.S. Senate. He was invited back in 2011 to give the keynote address at the annual Climate Change Denial Conference of the Heartland Institute. This is a think tank that was funded by tobacco interests back in the 1980s to debunk the science linking tobacco products to human health ailments, and today they're paid by fossil fuel interests to try to debunk, to confuse the public and policymakers about the reality and threat of climate change. And James Inhofe was invited to be their keynote speaker, but he had to back out at the last minute. He had gotten ill swimming in a lake back in Oklahoma that was suffering from an algal bloom as a result of the unprecedented heat and drought that Oklahoma was experiencing that summer. The next argument, okay, well maybe it's not natural, but it'll be self-correcting. It'll correct itself. And unless you mean that raising sea level several hundred feet will snuff out all of the coal-fired power plants, no, we can easily reestablish the atmospheric CO2 levels that existed at the time the dinosaurs roamed the poles, where there's no ice on the face of the Earth. Now, Earth can adapt to changes that take place, changes like that take place over 100 million years. The early Cretaceous was 100 million years ago. And all that carbon got buried through natural processes. And what we're doing today is literally unburying all of that carbon that got buried beneath the surface of the Earth, but 1 million times faster than nature. Not over a time scale of 100 million years, over a time scale of 100 years. And there's no evidence that we, let alone other living things, can adapt to changes on that time scale of that magnitude. Well, then the argument goes, all right, well, maybe it's not natural, maybe it's not self-correcting, but hey, it'll be good for us. Melting ice sheets lift all boats after all. Well, unless, you think that, a world with an increasing global population competing for less food, less water, and less land, that sounds good to you. Well, that's the sort of future that we're talking about. And again, don't listen to me, don't listen to the Sierra Club, listen to what our national security leaders are saying, that this is the greatest national security threat that we face. And again, we're very privileged to have in this room one of the true leaders on that topic here, David Tipley. Okay, well, and finally, the argument is, we spent so much time debating this, it's too late. We can't do anything about it now. The good news is that it's not. There is still time to make the cuts in carbon emissions that we need to make to avert dangerous climate change. That was our message to Warren Buffett today, that there is still time to make the decisions necessary to ensure that we don't leave behind a fundamentally degraded planet for our children and grandchildren, but time is running out. There's a great urgency to this. So we've seen sort of climate change denial. There's this war on climate science that's been waged by fossil fuel industry, front groups, think tanks funded by the fossil fuel industry, paid advocates, some of the same scientists who deny human-caused climate change today, who are paid by the fossil fuel industry to do that, were paid decades ago to try to debunk the science of tobacco and lung cancer. Literally the same scientists, I call them deniers for hire, all-purpose deniers. So there is this war on climate science, and as I've already alluded to, the hypocrisy when it comes to climate change denial can be pretty remarkable. The example of James Inhofe and his cancellation. The Heartland Institute, being one of those think tanks, had to cancel out because of the impact that climate change had on his own health. Another example that's sort of close to home for me, Ken Cuccinelli was the former Attorney General of Virginia, a Tea Party Republican. When he came in as Attorney General, one of his first acts was to try to subpoena all of my personal emails from the time I was at the University of Virginia, using a civil investigative demand. This was a tool that was created for the Attorney General to actually deal with Medicare fraud. But Cuccinelli reasoned that since I had been working on the science of climate change when I was at the University of Virginia, and the science of climate change is clearly a fraud, this was a perfectly appropriate application of the civil investigative demand. Well, the courts didn't really agree with him. First of all, the Washington Post, I should say, weighed in on this matter no less than 5 times, denouncing Ken Cuccinelli's witch hunt against me at the University of Virginia. If I forgot to mention it, probably just a coincidence that Cuccinelli, much of his funding did come from fossil fuel interests. And their award-winning editorial cartoonist, Tom Tolles, who, as you know, I've now written a book with, weighed in at the time on the matter, not once, but twice. I have to say, this is my favorite. It's Cuccinelli up in the judge's chair. For Galileo, he wants his emails too. I don't mind being compared to Galileo, I guess. Well, the lower court quashed Cuccinelli's civil investigative demand on a technicality. In his 40-page filing to the court, he had forgotten to provide evidence of wrongdoing on my part. So run out by the court. He was challenged all the way to the state Supreme Court, which ruled on the case with prejudice, meaning they really don't want to ever see something like this come back to the courts, shooting down his witch hunt. Undeterred, Ken Cuccinelli went on to run for governor of Virginia in the next election. You might understand why I was motivated to actively campaign with his opponent. I had seen firsthand the sort of damage that Ken Cuccinelli could do to the state of Virginia. And I did campaign with his opponent, Terry McAuliffe, who was victorious. Ken Cuccinelli lost the election, and I'm not making this up, you can Google this later if you like. Ken Cuccinelli went off to work on an oyster farm on an island, Tangier Island, in the Chesapeake Bay that's slowly succumbing to the effects of global sea level rise. As I said, climate change, there is no greater hypocrisy than the denial of climate change. Well, talk solutions. Now, some of the critics will say, all right, so maybe we've got a problem, and here's how we solve it. And this is very popular among sort of many of our captains of industry, people from sort of technology, the world of technology. We can engineer our way out of this problem. We'll continue to burn fossil fuels, but we will do other things. We'll shoot particles into the stratosphere, reflective sulfate particles that will block out some of the sun, and that could keep the Earth from warming up. Or we'll dump iron into the ocean to try to fertilize the algae and get them to take more of the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And every time you look into in some detail into these so-called geoengineering approaches, the principle of unintended consequences really emerges. We could end up screwing things up even more by interfering with a system that we don't understand perfectly, by trying to offset one problem by another problem. And I'm often reminded of the song many of us grew up with. There was an old lady who swallowed a fly. She swallowed the frog, swallowed the fly. What killed her in the end was the horse, of course, right? The solution was far worse than the problem in that case. And so we titled our chapter on geoengineering, or what could possibly go wrong. Now, lest you think that this is just a joke, something we can dismiss entirely with humor, our current Secretary of State, a former CEO of ExxonMobil, one might understand why he likes a solution that allows us to continue to burn carbon and mine fossil fuels, but we'll engineer our way out of the problem. That's the view of our Secretary of State. It's the view of Bill Gates, who is on the board of advisors, is on the board of the directors, thank you, of Berkshire Hathaway, has advocated the geoengineering solutions to the climate change problem. He has put much more funding into geoengineering research than he's put into actual climate change research or renewables, research into renewable energy. So Bill Gates is sort of on the right side of this problem. He understands climate change is real. He said it's a real threat. Warren Buffett has acknowledged as much as well. But this is often, we'll find that this idea of geoengineering is often favored by people in the corporate world, as if we can just find some other way of solving the problem. As I said, if we were to pursue that sort of strategy, with some possible exceptions, one geoengineering solution involves literally sucking the CO2 back out of the atmosphere. Now, that would probably be relatively harmful. I mean, harmless would be relative. I mean, but you're trying to get the genie back into the bottle, and you're fighting the laws of thermodynamics as well as the laws of economics. It would be much cheaper to just stop putting the carbon into the atmosphere in the first place. So most likely that's the real solution here. That's the path forward. It isn't to wish for a climate policy. It's to actually do something. And the fact is that even in this era of Trump, where it's easy to become dispirited about prospects for progress in dealing with climate change, we've had some amazing progress. We've seen some amazing progress over the past 1 or 2 years. The Paris Summit, which doesn't solve the problem, but it puts us on a path towards keeping CO2 levels below dangerous levels. It turns out that if all the countries make good on their commitments, and now the U.S.'s commitment is suddenly called into question, but if all the other countries make good on their commitment, it would be enough to nearly cut our carbon emissions halfway from what they would otherwise be, which would give us a 7 to 9 degree Fahrenheit warming planet by the end of the century, halfway to the sort of 3.5 degree Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius level that we often think of as where we get into the most dangerous climate change impacts. So it gets us halfway to where we need to be. It puts in place a process where we can now see our way to a solution. The encyclical by Pope Francis in my view, was a very important development. It helped reframe this issue where I think it needs to be. It isn't just a matter of science, economics, politics, or policy. It's a matter of ethics, of intergenerational ethics. The decisions we are making today determine what sort of planet we're going to leave behind, as I said before, for our children and grandchildren. Whether you see that through sort of the lens of our biblical responsibility to be protectors of creation, to be stewards of the earth, or you see that through the lens of a parent who wants us to leave behind a planet that isn't degraded for our children and grandchildren. It's really the same issue. It's about our ethical obligation to make decisions now that don't essentially mortgage the planet, future generations. So we have this challenge now. Donald Trump, by the way, just a short story here. When the galleys for the book came back, so the book was published in September, the galleys came back in August, it was already becoming clear that Donald Trump, maybe that was going to be an important development, and we realized we didn't have a Trump cartoon in the book. So this was actually done at the very last minute. Tom drafted up this cartoon, and it nicely featured the wall. But the wall in this case is being a wall that Donald Trump has created, isolating himself from the reality of climate change, and of course we will all pay for it. And he has pursued, this headline says, sort of a scorched earth approach to climate change. He's appointed to cabinet level positions individuals who deny the science of climate change or who have very close ties to fossil fuel interests, like former ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson or Scott Pruitt, the EPA administrator, who has close ties to the Koch brothers, and as Attorney General, basically ghost wrote policy statements for fossil fuel interests and presenting them as official government policy. So we do find ourselves with this challenge. Now we have, rather than a president who embraces our role in global leadership on this issue, which Barack Obama did, through our diplomacy with China, through our role in the Paris negotiations, through the passage of the Clean Power Plan. We have a president who is threatening an administration and representatives of all of the major government administration officials who are trying to undo the progress that's been made. Some of us have been out there trying to take climate change denying politicians to task. A few weeks ago, I was marching in Washington, D.C. I spoke at the D.C. Science Rally, marched with my good friend Bill Nye. We have to be out there literally in the streets. And this was a story that journalists felt like they had to cover. It isn't every day that you see scientists marching in the streets. And when scientists are marching in the streets, rather than spending their time where they prefer to be spending their time, in the lab, out in the field, teaching students, writing papers, when scientists are spending their time doing that, you know that we have a crisis. And it speaks to the fact that we need to hear not just the voices of scientists, all of our voices need to be heard. Those of us who care about the future of this planet need to be doing all those things that we know we can do to raise awareness among our friends, our family, our colleagues, to encourage people to vote in the midterm elections. We need to make sure we hold our policymakers accountable for our interests rather than the short-term interests of the fossil fuel corporations, which too often fund their campaigns. So if anything, personal involvement is even more important now than it was before. We can still solve this problem. The rest of the world is moving ahead. The states, municipalities are moving ahead. We've seen carbon emissions now plateau. We're starting to sort of bend that curve downward because of the massive growth around the world in renewable energy. We're starting to move in the right direction. But we need to make sure that here in the U.S. we continue to take the leadership role that we've always taken. So let me leave by simply emphasizing that the planet really, literally does lie in the balance. So our efforts couldn't be more important now. Thank you.
We will take questions from the audience. Does anybody have one to start off with? All right, good.
Do you mind talking about the personal price that you have paid to do what you do? Like, I mean, they threatened you and your family and stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, the good news is there isn't much left that they can do that they haven't already tried to do. So it's sort of, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You learn the hockey stick curve. When we published the hockey stick curve back in the late 1990s, I was still a postdoctoral researcher. I didn't realize that at that point, whether I liked it or not, I had placed myself at the very center of the fractious larger public debate over human-caused climate change. And in my previous book, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, I talked much more about sort of my personal experiences on the front lines, which is the subtitle of the book, On the Front Lines of the Climate Wars. So, on the one hand, and people sometimes ask me if I could do it over again. Back in the early 1990s, when I was sort of headed off to do research in theoretical physics, and I decided I wanted to work on something that had more real-world implications. And I decided to use math and physics, which I had learned to work on this amazing scientific problem of modeling Earth's climate system, which seemed like a fascinating scientific problem that had real-world implications. If I could do a do-over on that and instead go off into theoretical physics, would I make a different choice? And the answer is, I don't even have to think about it, because although I have had to withstand attacks and all sorts of battles, and I have battle scars to prove it, what more noble pursuit could one be involved in than trying to inform the public discourse and having a role and having an ability to inform the larger public discourse, including talking to Warren Buffett, to inform the discourse over arguably the greatest challenge that we face as a civilization. I consider myself, frankly, blessed to have been in a position to do that. So, yes, although there are all sorts of stories I can tell about attacks on me, nasty threats against me, my family, envelopes with white powder that had to be literally checked out by the FBI, and I could go on and on. Congressional subpoenas. In fact, I've lost count of the number of congressional subpoenas now. They just sit on my desk. It's, again, I would, if I were going to do it over, I wouldn't do things any differently.
Well, first I want to say thank you very much for what you do, even though there's so much risk that you've had with it. But I've caught the fact that you're hopeful. And
I'm sorry, what?
You said you were hopeful.
Yeah.
You said that there's still time and things like that. And, I understand we should be entering an ice age, and we should be on the beginning of an ice age, but, we're so warm now that we're reversing that. And 350.org, I believe, is named because we weren't supposed to go past that, and we've blown past 400. I don't even know where we are now.
Yeah, they didn't want to change the name to 400.org because the domain name was already taken.
So, with those two things in my mind, I don't feel very hopeful, but I want you to talk a little bit more about why you do feel hopeful.
Yeah, so thanks. There's a lot of interesting sort of components of that question. And it's true, we would be very slowly descending into the next ice age. If you look at sort of the geological pattern, or there are changes in our orbit relative to the sun that lead to the coming and going of the ice ages, and we would be ever so slowly descending into the next ice age by just a tiny fraction of a degree per century. And human impact on the climate has completely overwhelmed that. In fact, a good friend, former colleague of mine, Bill Ruddiman, sort of brought to the fore the notion that the early Anthropocene hypothesis, the fact that even 6,000 years ago, you can see where livestock cultivation and agriculture was starting to sort of bend that CO2 curve away from the natural pattern. So even 6,000 years ago, we started to take hold of our climate, but it wasn't until about 150 to 200 years ago, through the Industrial Revolution, that we firmly took hold of the climate level, the climate dial, if you will. So the reason I'm optimistic is just, for the same reason that if you were an advocate for whales, you could be optimistic in the late 19th century that we would move past that. When we moved out of the age of whale oil because something cheaper and better came along, fossil fuels. And now something better and cheaper has come along. And the era of fossil fuels is over. Now it's understandable that some vested interests who have assets worth millions of dollars want to make sure that they have an opportunity to monetize those assets. And they're going to fight tooth and nail to extend the age of fossil fuels out as far as they can. And that's what we're seeing right now with fossil fuel interests trying to slow down progress on this issue. And we have had this temporary setback here in the U.S. where those interests now are in control of the reins of our government, at least for the short term. But the rest of the world is moving on. At this point, the only decision the U.S. gets to make is whether we get on board or we get left behind in this revolution. And I hope we make the right decision, but the world is moving on, and I'm very confident that that is the case. And then there was a gentleman here. Yeah.
The U.S. National Academy of Sciences has supported climate change, and why haven't they had more of an influence on the government, or the government relying on them more to come up with opinions about this issue?
I don't need a
question in the back. You need a meeting.
Oh, okay. They're next. Yes. Okay. Sorry. I should have let you. Why is it that our government isn't listening to our scientists? We live. I mean, you allude to something. A very good question. How is it that we have allowed, ourselves to lapse back into this world of alternative facts and fake news, where we can have a president who makes policy based on assertions that are just factually untrue. They're just patently false. And some of it has to do with, I think, the challenges in sort of the world of the new media in holding our policymakers accountable. We have sort of lost the media environment that many of us grew up in, where Walter Cronkite could say on the evening news, and that's the way it was on May 6th, 2017, and we could all accept that those were the facts and agree to differ in our opinions about what the implications of those facts are. We now live, it's the Wild West as far as facts are concerned now, and that makes it very difficult to have the meaningful debates about the real issues when we can't even agree on the basic facts that climate change is real. So I think that, why is that? How have we moved into that sort of media environment? There are many people who are far more, studied on that issue, who could speak to that. People in I'm sure there are folks here in media studies who, can speak to that. But I just feel that sort of what we felt was the democratization of news when the internet sort of took off, and the sort of We found ourselves in the world of a 24-hour news cycle and an internet news world and the news media, and many of us thought initially that that was sort of democratizing, but I think in many ways it's balkanizing, and it's allowed people to increasingly isolate themselves in these sort of bubbles of epistemic closure, where they're now, you know, if you watch Fox News, which has the largest viewership, I think still, although that may be changing, but of any of the cable news networks, you would be led to think that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by scientists like me who are trying to get rich off of government grant money. And that is the prevailing paradigm. And if you have millions of people who are, believe that, and you have gerrymandered districts that allow politicians to continue to make similar statements, it's hard. It's hard to make progress. That's why we have to fight to get our government back. We've lost it temporarily. We need to get it back. I'll let you do the choosing.
Great.
Great. So I'm interested in, I'm a environmental sociologist at Creighton, and one of the things that the American Sociological Association's big task force report on climate change just came out. I think you may know Riley Dunlap. So it's saying, part of the problem of trying to merge the social and natural science has been this idea that climate change can become a post-political issue, right? We can avoid talking about the role of political ideologies. But what we see in the studies in sociology and public science journals is there's an interaction effect, right, between your level of education and political ideology and where you stand in relationship to the scientific consensus. So if you're a strong conservative, the more education you have, the further you are likely to deny, right? It divides. So I'm wondering how your experience has shaped the way you think about this question of, to what extent is the political fight on climate change something that we have to take head-on in terms of political ideology, that is also a debate about what makes for a good society and those sort of political normative values, versus the kind of focus on technological solutions like geoengineering and appealing to the values that people already have rather than trying to transform those values?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the foes of action sort of saw, decades ago realized that, in fact, there were these internal memos from Frank Luntz that were released in 2002. Frank Luntz, a Republican pollster, that basically telegraphed their strategy. It said that this was basically these were internal memos to fossil fuel interests and to Republicans representing fossil fuel interests, that they needed to continue to manufacture sort of a debate. They needed to convince the public that there was a scientific debate, because if the public was led to believe that there was a scientific consensus about climate change, they would demand action be taken. And so they advised them to sort of change the language, to fund think tanks and front groups and individual paid advocates to create this sort of echo chamber of alternative facts. We saw alternative facts in the world of climate change now. We were dealing with this stuff, alternative facts, fake news, before it became fashionable. It's now sort of polluted our entire public discourse. But we saw it first in the area of climate change, where powerful vested interests realized that if they could maintain the appearance of a debate and divide the public. As you alluded to, all you need to do is divide the public. You don't need to win the argument. If you want to prevent action from being from taking place, you just need to divide the public on the issue. And so they needed to make climate change denial part of the tribal identity of conservatism in this country. It's not a natural alliance. In fact, many have argued that the evangelical community naturally should be aligned with the case for action, but through this, forgive the pun, unholy alliance between the religious right and the corporate right, climate change denial is now actually one of the tenets of the religious right. And you can only understand that because of this sort of historical, political origin. So we're now in this world where it's part of, as you alluded to, it's part of the conservative ideology. If you want to be a card-carrying, conservative, you've got to be able to check that box. And it's difficult for you to face your fellow conservatives and tell them that you care about climate change. Just ask Bob Inglis, the Republican who was primaried out of his office because of that. And now travels the country talking to conservatives about why they should. So it's sort of coming full circle. So there are sort of two things going on. Yeah, there are these spheres that we can no longer reach. When I give a public lecture on climate change, a lot of the folks who come out are, I don't want to say are part of the choir, but I don't get a lot of hardcore climate change deniers coming out to my talks. It's a self-selecting audience. And so to speak to those constituencies, to speak to sort of that dismissive fringe, by some measure about 15% of our public, is not just denies climate change, they're passionate in their denial about climate change, posting on Facebook and trying to influence others. And to have a pointy-headed academic like me come in and lecture to them about climate change may not be effective. But to have my colleague Dave Titley talk to them about the national security implications of climate change might reach them in a way that in sort of approaching it from the side door, because the front door is locked. You've got to look for the side door. That side door can be sort of evangelical Christian faith. Catherine Hayhoe is a fellow climate scientist, very respected climate scientist and an evangelical Christian, and she speaks to those audiences. Bob Inglis, who I mentioned, was a Republican from South Carolina. He's a good friend of mine now. With a nearly 100% perfect conservative lifetime voting record, but he made one mistake. He decided to speak out about climate change because he saw that, as an evangelical Christian, he saw it as his responsibility. His children convinced him that he had to do something about this issue, and he spoke out about the issue and got primaried by the Koch brothers out of his office, the seat that's now held by someone you may have heard of, Trey Gowdy, led the Benghazi committee, was the favored candidate of the Koch brothers. Bob Inglis, that unleashed him to travel around the country now, lecturing to conservative audiences, trying to convince them that solving environmental problems through market mechanisms is completely consistent with sort of conservative thinking. Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush initially, before Dick Cheney came in, Richard Nixon founded the EPA. So Republicans were firmly on, in support of market mechanisms for solving environmental problems. And Bob Inglis is sort of trying to convince his fellow conservatives that they need to come around. They need to get off the anti-science train. That's not a place you want to be. And engage in the legitimate debate over how we solve this problem. And as you may have read, there's this coalition now in Congress with Democrats as well as Republicans searching for sort of a middle ground on this. About a month ago, a number of influential Republicans, Hank Paulson, James Baker from the Reagan administration, and George Shultz came out in support of a revenue-neutral carbon tax, which conservatives like because, somebody mentioned CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a great organization, lobbies for a revenue-neutral carbon tax. It's appealing to many conservatives because you're not increasing taxation overall, you're just shifting taxes around from where you think they should be to where you think they shouldn't be. So I think that's important, and I think there are many messengers who can be very effective with those audiences in ways that I probably can't. At the same time, I tend to focus my efforts on what I see as the sweet spot, sort of the confused middle. You've got sort of this 15% of these dismissives, and you can spend a lot of time and effort trying to convince Uncle Joe at Thanksgiving that climate change isn't a massive hoax, and you debunk one of his talking points, and he'll just come back with another, and you can go on and spend a lot of time doing that. The same amount of time and effort that could have been spent maybe informing a dozen people who are honestly confused. They're in the middle. They don't have strong political views about it, but they've been led to believe that there is a debate because of the fake debate that's been generated. So that's where I tend to focus my efforts, recognizing that there is progress still to be made, in sort of the world of dismissives, and there's no one sort of uniquely qualified messenger. You need to find trusted messengers for different constituencies.
It's my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the rate of global warming may increase with the loss of the polar ice. Now, when you say that it may not be too late to turn the ship around, are you able to share any notion about what benchmarks need to be achieved within what time frame in order to avoid catastrophe?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a difficult question to answer because there's certain so-called tipping points where you can pass the tipping point and you can set in motion some set of processes that you can't stop. And the question is, how long does it take them to play out? So when you talk about polar ice, one of the things that we increasingly fear is that we pass the tipping point for the stability of the West Antarctic ice sheet. Meaning that it will eventually collapse. We've set in motion, we've destabilized the ice shelves that through warming of the southern oceans, it's destabilized the ice shelves. Those ice shelves are what prop up the inland ice. So once you lose the ice shelves, then the inland ice can start to surge out to sea, and we're seeing that happen. And best as we can tell, there's sort of nothing to stop that now. So we could lose most of the West Antarctic ice sheet. The question is, how long will that, and that's about 14 feet of global sea level. That's right there. Where we lose them. Now, if we're lucky, it takes hundreds of years, and some of the models suggest that it could take hundreds of years for that to play out, just because of the slow nature of those processes. On the other hand, you know, and the critics love to point to uncertainty, and that Bret Stephens, the New York Times columnist who I mentioned, loves to point to uncertainty as if it's a reason for inaction, but uncertainty actually is a reason for even more concerted action, because if anything, uncertainty hasn't been our friend. What we've learned from the ongoing science that we've done over the last 10 years is that there are many processes that weren't in the climate models, that when we put them into the models, some of these things can happen faster. That's particularly true with respect to the collapse of ice sheets. And Dave and I have a colleague, Dave Pollard, at Penn State, who's literally perhaps the world's leading ice sheet modeler. And they had an article come out last year in Nature that demonstrated a new process that has to do with sort of the collapse of ice cliffs and this instability that once it happens, it again feeds back on itself and accelerates. And their work suggests that we could see the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet considerably faster than many of the previous models that didn't have that process in them. And so people often ask me, where's the tipping point? And the answer is there is no one tipping point. There are many, and some of them we've crossed, and some of them we cannot do. But like mines in a minefield, there are many more that are out there. And what we do know for certain is that the more we warm the planet, the more likely it is that we cross these critical tipping points. Sort of our best objective assessment is that if we could bring stabilized CO2 levels below 450 parts per million, we're at about 400, a little over 400 now. Turns out we have to bend that emissions curve down pretty dramatically, because remember, the CO2 concentration increases as long as emissions are positive. So just bringing emissions down isn't enough. You have to bring them down very rapidly if you're going to avoid accumulating enough CO2 in the atmosphere. To avoid 450 parts per million, we have to bend that curve down pretty dramatically now. 450 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. So there's 350 ppm, which was mentioned before. We'd love to see 350 ppm, but we're now battling to keep it below 450 ppm. And above 450 ppm is where we fear we set in motion a lot of these potentially irreversible processes. The release of methane into the atmosphere from melting permafrost, and I can go on and on. So, like, you know, a minefield, the only safe sort of safe course of action is to not venture out onto the minefield, and that's what we need to not do.
We have two more, and then we'll call it quits.
You mentioned Citizens Climate Lobby and their process of taxing, getting a bill passed. I'd just like to thank our representative, Don Bacon, for joining the bipartisan caucus.
Republican, right?
He is a Republican, a brand new Republican on our members of Congress list.
Yeah.
So, but I wondered if you could expand a little bit more about what Citizens Climate Lobby is planning to do. And I'll just do a shameless plug. Pick up a yellow sheet on your way out if you want to learn more about us. We've got a meeting next Saturday.
You may know more about Citizens Climate Lobby. I do. I did speak at their annual meeting last summer, and really enjoyed that, to have over 1,000 people there who come from every state They're there to lobby their local congresspeople, their senators and their representatives, as well as to participate in the meeting. But all of them were supposed to go out and actually schedule time with staffers or congresspeople themselves. And it is, I think that there is an opportunity for this meeting of the minds when it comes to solutions to this problem. The idea of a revenue-neutral carbon tax seems to be, you know, a compromise where you might be able to get progressives and enough conservatives on board for, you know, so that there is a critical mass for policy progress. Probably not under the current Congress, maybe under the 2-year-away Congress, depending on what happens in the midterm elections. Change can happen rapid, just like in the climate. Political change can happen rapidly, and perhaps in this case, it's for the good. You know, so I very much support the work that CCL is doing. I tend to avoid taking an official position as to what the form of the solution should be. Should it be a carbon tax, a revenue-neutral carbon tax, tradable emissions, cap and trade? My feeling is that that is a worthy debate for our policymakers to have in good faith, as long as it's informed by an objective assessment of what the risks are. And that's, I would be thrilled if that's what we were debating in Congress right now. What form of price should we put on carbon, rather than is climate change an elaborate hoax? Where I testified at the House Science Committee, where that was the sort of contravening assumption of the chair of that committee, Lamar Smith of Texas, that climate change is a hoax. I was with one representative of the scientific mainstream, and there were 3 climate change contrarians. That's why you saw that image of, there was something, you know, that somebody, it was a meme that was going around of 96 other me's in that room, along with, to get the balance more where it should have been. But thanks for the question. CCL, great work. I don't have an official position on the form of the solution, but I love the fact that they are working towards a consensus sort of solution that involves progressives and conservatives. I think that's really important.